Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to my Maybe Midrash video. Maybe Midrash is a kind of a month-long reading thing created by Jason Oblu's Chapter and Verse, Little Prairie Library, and Steve Donahue. And the idea is that I think, I may have misconstrued the idea. The idea is that you're supposed to kind of reflect on an issue of faith or religion and then kind of read a work of nonfiction related to religion and faith, and then read a work of fiction that calls to mind issues of religion or faith. And what I did was I identified an issue in Buddhism which has long, given me pause, and then related it to a work of fiction. So the work of fiction I'm relating it to is Milan Kundera's Unbearable Lightness of Being. And the issue at the heart of this, for me, the religious issue, is the aspect of Buddhism which suggests that the way to escape suffering of life is to free yourself from your kind of mental obsessions with acquiring things or with, physical possessions, and then also to free yourself from worry about people, and to kind of free yourself from this obsessive worry about your loved one, your family members. It's that part of this kind of Buddhist thing that has always given me pause, and it brought to mind for me kind of the theme, perhaps, I thought, of the unbearable lightness of being. So to kind of get down to that, I felt like I had to read up on this issue in terms of Buddhism. Now, before I go any further, I kind of talked about this subject in my Saturday Hodgepodge video, and I probably shouldn't have because my thoughts weren't really fully formed at that time. But in that video, I mistakenly said that, well, what I end up saying in the video is that I felt like my lack of faith was a character flaw on my part. That's not really what I meant. I don't see lack of faith as a character flaw. What I was relating that to for myself was the idea that impatience, my impatience, that's the character flaw, that I'm an impatient person, that impatience is why I can't commit myself to religious practice and then maybe give faith a chance. And it's not the lack of faith then that's a character flaw. And several people, asked me about that, and the comment section of that video was so great. I enjoyed that discussion so much, and everybody was perfectly kind about it. But I did want to make sure that I corrected that. I'm not saying a lack of faith is a character flaw. It's my impatience that's my character flaw, and that impatience then, I think, contributes to my inability to have this faith or to accept religious practice. Anyway, so before I got into this issue of lightness, which is what I'm going to call it, this issue of, how does one free oneself, perhaps, of this obsessive worry about family and loved ones, etc. And before I took that up in the fictional work of The Unbearable Lightness of Being, I decided to reread How to Practice the Way to a Meaningful Life by the Dalai Lama, which is really just a really basic primer for kind of how to apply Buddhism and Buddhist principles to your life to, improve the quality of your life. And this was very instructive on that subject. So for me, because I'm impatient, one of the things that impatience has led me to is this idea that before I'm willing to commit to some kind of religious idea or practice, I want to understand it all in full. Which, having read How to Practice, is, clearly not possible, because what I want to do is I want to know all the answers before I'm willing to have faith, which is not how faith works. And so if I really want to understand the Buddhist point of view, truly understand, not just intellectually understand, but truly understand how one frees oneself of obsessive worry about family, I have to commit to the practices which Buddhists believe lead to that understanding. And so that's something I've had to come to grips with. But the issue, and this is just me intellectualizing the issue through reading, the issue of that kind of lightness, of freeing yourself of that obsessive worry about family and loved ones, really comes down to an issue of control. So when we obsessively worry, like when I obsessively worry about my daughter when she drives 4 hours from one city to another, when I worry about what might happen to her, that what I'm really kind of doing is imagining all these things which could happen, and I am not living in the present. I'm not in this moment. I am trying to think of all the things that could happen so that I could prepare myself and her for how to handle all the things that could happen, and this then is about control. So, at least in part, what I believe, thanks to my reading and thanks to a great Voxer conversation I had with Sarah from Hardcover Hearts, is that to truly kind of grasp this idea of freeing oneself from that kind of obsessive worry, you have to come to the realization that you're not really in control, that you can't control what happens necessarily in your own life, but in anyone else's either. And that this kind of always projecting and always thinking about what could happen is in some ways an example of not being present and not being mindful of what's going on right now. And that is a kind of important practice key to understanding Buddhism. The other thing is, though, that I've learned is kind of this Buddhist idea, and maybe it's just Tibetan Buddhism is expressed by the Dalai Lama here. One of the things I've also learned is that within the mind of the Dalai Lama and Buddhists who believe like he does, that there is this kind of competing idea of emptiness and dependent arising. And this then I think is also key to understanding why you don't have control, but why and how you might then free yourself from that obsessive worry. And I'm not saying I have it all. And at the same time still behave in a way which shows caring and compassion for other people. So here's what I think it comes down to. Essentially, nothing has inherent existence. According to the Dalai Lama here, in Buddhism, nothing has inherent existence, since everything's existence is dependent on something else, whether it's a table or a person or Zelda here, that we don't have inherent existence. Therefore, the reality is that emptiness is a reality, that there are no things, people that exist inherently. Instead, we all have an existence through dependent arising, that our dependency as one kind of connected, our dependency on one another then is the source of our existence. We come to existence because of others, and therefore our existence depends on others. Therefore, we don't have inherent existence. Therefore, we are dependent on and affect others. What we do affects others. What we do affects our own future. That's kind of what's at the heart of this, and I hope I'm expressing this correctly. So if we don't really exist, then this leads this idea, which I think for me was a misconception about the Buddhist concept of lightness, that life is ephemeral, that life is kind of, you're supposed to free yourself from all these things which might hold you down and weigh you down and cause you worry. And with material objects, I don't really have too big a problem with that, but with, obsessive worry about my family, I certainly do. So then that brings up the issue, if, we don't have control, and if life is ephemeral, if life is relatively fleeting, and, all these other things, then why should we behave in a way which we would, connect to virtue, or we would connect to doing the right things, or morality? Well, Buddhists also have an answer for that, and that is that since we are all dependent, that we should behave with compassion. That compassion should be one of those things which governs our behavior. That even though we can't control other people's lives or necessarily our own, if we behave with compassion, we might lessen the suffering of others. So my example would be here is if someone is hungry and you feed them, you alleviate their immediate physical suffering. But if you came up with a way to feed them and to eliminate the problem of feeding themselves from their minds, you also free them spiritually from this obsessive worry about food. And this then is why we should behave compassionately, and then is why we should think about others when we're making decisions about what we should do. There you go. That's where I am right now in terms of understanding that concept of freeing yourself from earthly concerns while still behaving like a moral, compassionate person. And then that brings me to talking about Kundera's book, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. So at the beginning of the book, and you need to understand, this is something I had forgotten, probably thanks to the movie. Forgive me, I have my notes here. Something I'd forgotten, probably thanks to the movie, is that the book is, overtly philosophical. That in a way in which the movie isn't. And so, Kundera is a presence in the book as the narrator, and he is clearly telling the story. And these characters are clearly, in some ways, representations of his own thought. As a matter of fact, he says as much. So at the very beginning of the book, Kundera himself kind of outlines the parameters of the philosophy which he is kind of exploring in this novel. And he starts off with kind of a refutation of Nietzsche's idea of recurrence. Now, I didn't know this before I read this book and did a little research, but apparently Nietzsche had this idea that life was essentially recurred, that we lived through the same things over and over and over again, that there was this recurrence of life, that no matter what we did, we were going to be more or less doomed to go back and live that same existence all over again with virtually no changes. This, from Kundera's point of view, is wrong thinking, because what Kundera says is that if that were true, if we just lived the same life and life was recurring, then things that we did would be far more significant, and we would be unable to forgive people for the things that they did wrong, that we would not be able to allow that time would not blur the edges of what someone had did wrong or what had caused some kind of a conflict or problem, because the more often they happen, the more significant they would become. What Kundera instead suggests is this idea that the opposite is true, that we essentially live one life, and therefore life is ephemeral and fleeting, and that it doesn't necessarily matter what we do in the long run. Even our mistakes, even the things that we have done wrong, even the damage and harm we've caused people, eventually will be forgotten or forgiven. And there is a certain kind of historical logic to that. When we think back on Napoleon, or we think back on other figures from history, we can be very critical of what they've done. And yet at the same time, over time, we kind of begin to perhaps think sympathetically with those people, or we begin to see the connections between their lives and ours, and we start thinking, well, once we think that, then they're not these horrible monsters who've done these terrible things. They're just people who've done terrible things that happened in the past. Anyway, so Kundera combines that with the philosophical ideas of a 6th century philosopher named Parmenides, who essentially said that the world is made up of opposites, positive and negative, and that we should obviously try to choose the positives and ignore the negatives. Kundera then posits this idea that lightness, this living life as though essentially it doesn't matter what you do, is paired with heaviness, living life as though what you do matters. And then the question, in looking from Parmenides' point of view, is which one is good and which one is bad? Which is positive, which is negative? Is living with lightness positive, or is living with heaviness positive? And essentially, that is the philosophical crux of the novel. Okay, so in the novel, we are presented, I'm going to say, with 4 main characters. The 2 main characters are actually Sabina and Tomas, but there's also Teresa and Franz, and these 4 main characters are involved in 3 relationships. The first relationship is the relationship between Sabina and Tomas, which is present in the beginning of the book. Both Sabina and Tomas, at the beginning of the book, has essentially freed themselves of all responsibilities that might give weight or heaviness to their lives. They are disassociated from their families. They are apolitical they are essentially living life without responsibility. They are lovers, Sabina and Tomas, but they each have multiple other lovers, and they don't, feel the bonds of love connecting them, or, and from their point of view, tying them down, crushing them, burdening them, weighing them down, and that's how they live their lives. So both those characters in the beginning are living these lives of lightness. But really quickly in the book, Tomas's life is changed by the introduction of a character named Teresa. Teresa is someone who needs him. Teresa is a woman that he meets and he intends to treat like all the other women in his life, but he finds he can't. He feels her need for him. He begins to feel a need to protect her. He begins to feel love for her. Now, this is a long process for Tomas over the course of the book, in which he comes to a greater and greater realization of how that love to Teresa limits the other things he can do. It limits where he can live. It limits what kind of job he can have. It limits how political he can be. It limits his ability to have sex with other women. And as the story goes along, he goes from being a character who is living this kind of lightness, style of light, to a character who is living a weighty, heavy kind of life. A life of responsibility, a life of commitment, a life of compassion to other people. Sabina is doing the opposite. Sabina's the other man really in Sabina's life that's a character in the book is Franz. And Franz is key, from Franz's point of view, Sabina is his mistress. Franz is married and Sabina is his mistress. At one point, Franz confesses to his wife that he's having an affair with Sabina, and he breaks off his marriage, intending then to make a life with Sabina. When Sabina finds out that this has happened, the first thing she thinks is of all the obligations this puts on her, of all the responsibilities she would have if she, stayed and committed herself or stayed in a relationship with Franz. And so rather than do that, she literally just kind of leaves in the middle of the night and relocates to another city, and they essentially never see one another again. And then Sabina, through the course of the book, goes through a series of increasingly transient relationships as she moves from one place to another. And even though she has feelings, this is an important part. Sabina feels for Franz, and she feels for Tomas. She even feels for Teresa. They meet and have scenes together. She feels for them, but she refuses to allow those feelings to tie her down, to give weight or responsibility to her life. And so as she gets older, as Tomas becomes more and more committed to Teresa and living a life of responsibility and love and compassion, Sabina is going the other way, where her relationships are increasingly transient and her ties to places are increasingly ephemeral, and until essentially, she ends up moving from Prague to Vienna to Paris to New York, and then to Los Angeles, where, if my memory serves, she dies of old age, while Tomas finds his life increasingly limited. He moves out of the city, in part to protect he and Teresa. They go live in the country. He gets a dog. The dog dies, and then he and Teresa are killed in a car accident. So Tomas takes on weight, lives a life no longer of lightness. Sabina lives a life of lightness. And she's the one who has to deal with this unbearableness of this life with no commitments and no real love or compassion, while Tomas embraces those things. And we're left to kind of ask the question, which one was right? Is Sabina's way of life right, or was Tomas's way of life right? Well, if you just want to base it on who dies and who lives, all the heavy characters, Tomas, Teresa, and Franz, because Franz is heavy too, because he wants this relationship with Sabina. He loves her, and he goes on to have other loving relationships. He becomes politically active again once he's free of Sabina. All three of those characters die in violent, tragic ways, and Sabina just kind of dies of old age with less and less connection to the people around her. So the question then is, which one is better or which one was worse? Well, based on what I've read and learned about Buddhism, I would say Buddhism would say that they're both wrong. That Buddhism is sometimes referred to as the middle path, and in here, this is a great example of how that would apply to the unbearable lightness of being. That a Buddhist would say that while Sabina has successfully freed herself perhaps from obsessive worry about physical possessions and love and, and worry about her loved ones, she doesn't live a life of compassion and love. She is not easing the suffering of others. She is not maintaining that connection that we all have between one another and doing things to, living a life of compassion. They'd also say that Tomas is too weighed down, that he believes that he can control things, that he is not necessarily being present or mindful because he insists on trying to control things about politics in Czechoslovakia, trying to control things about Teresa's safety, trying to control things about the health of his dog, anyway, that he's trying to exert control and that he has to give up that illusion of control and to embrace a certain idea that, that he doesn't have that, and be mindful and be present in the moment rather than trying to exert control. So there you go. I'm not sure that made sense, but that's my shot at maybe Midrash with blending or trying to understand the Buddhist concept of lightness and then applying that Buddhist idea to the concepts of lightness and heaviness explored by Milan Kundera in The Unbearable Lightness of Being. By the way, if you're wondering, my dog, Ike, who is in here whining and crying all the time, is clearly feeling the burden of life and worrying, while Zelda, who never really makes a noise other than to bark euphorically at other dogs and just enjoys looking out the window, has embraced the concept of lightness. Anyway, there you go. Let me know what you think about this video, about my thinking about Buddhism or Kundera's book in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching.